In 1941, the greatest army in Europe stood frozen outside Moscow. Not defeated by bullets, not crushed by tanks. It was defeated by distance, cold, and simple mathematics. This is the story of how Germany's unstoppable war machine destroyed itself before the Red Army even fired a shot. Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa. Over 3 million soldiers crossed into the Soviet Union. It was the largest invasion in human history. Germany expected another France, another fast collapse, another short war. They were catastrophically wrong. Johann Bauer wiped the sweat from his brow as he led his team of horses through a muddy field outside Brest-Litovsk. The sun had barely risen, yet the air already carried the stench of diesel, sweat, and fear. The world imagined the German army as a flawless machine, tanks gleaming and engines roaring. But Johann knew the truth. Behind every mechanized column, there were horses, thousands of them, sweating, straining, and shivering as they pulled artillery, wagons, and supply carts through fields churned into sticky clay by rain and retreating snow. He counted 30 in his own unit alone, each one essential, each one alive with terror and exhaustion. He had joined the Wehrmacht to serve in tanks, to be part of the unstoppable force that had conquered France in weeks. Instead, he found himself covered in mud, hands raw from rains, knees bruised from riding hours on end. Otto, a stubborn bay stallion, refused to move at a trot, forcing Johann to shout, kick, and curse, aware that any delay could mean the difference between life and death for the men following behind. Ammunition wagons rattled violently, threatening to spill their cargo of shells onto the churned earth. Food supplies, fragile and perishable, dangled from the carts, sodden and smelling of rot in the June heat. The horses were silent heroes, and the soldiers who relied on them rarely acknowledged it. Johann had seen comrades fall, not from bullets, but from exhaustion, dehydration, and the merciless sun beating down on them as they marched alongside their four-legged companions. One morning, he had found a young recruit slumped under a wagon, delirious, whispering apologies to the horse that had borne his weight. Johann had helped him to his feet, offering water and a bitterly hard piece of bread. The recruit had stared at him with empty eyes, then whispered, "I thought this was a machine war. How can machines die like this?" Every day was a race against decay. Wheels sank into mud, axles cracked under the weight of heavy shells, and the horses, with their muscles straining, slipped on hidden rocks and slick trails. Johann knew that without the animals, the army would stop entirely. Tanks could only move as far as the horses could carry the artillery behind them. Guns could only fire as long as ammunition made it to the front. Wounded men could only survive if the supply carts reached them. Each horse represented a lifeline, a fragile string connecting the army to its own ambition. At night, Johann would tie his animals to the nearest tree, letting them graze cautiously on what little grass the land offered. He would sit against a crate of rations, listening to the soft snorts and shuffles of their breaths in the dark, and imagine the world outside believing that this war was fought purely by steel and engine. The war, he realized, was fought on leather straps, hooves, and the patience of men willing to endure endless discomfort. The soldiers in Moscow or Berlin would read reports of Blitzkrieg victories and marvel at the efficiency of the German war machine. They would not see Johann sitting on a splintered wooden cart at 2 a.m., trying to coax a frightened mare over a log while shells exploded miles away. Sometimes he spoke quietly to Otto, imagining that the horse understood him. "You're stronger than any engine, old friend," he would whisper, patting his neck, feeling the sweat soak into his uniform. Otto would snort and shake his head, as if acknowledging the burden he bore. Johann knew that without these animals, the mechanized image of the army would collapse entirely. In truth, it was a fragile human and animal network barely holding itself together against distance, supply lines, and the relentless expanse of the Soviet Union. By the time the first villages appeared in the distance, Johann was numb with fatigue, his hands blistered, his back aching, his heart heavy with unspoken fear. He watched the sun rise over the horizon, casting long shadows across the wagons and the horses pulling them, And he understood that the war was less about tactics or strategy than endurance. Machines could break, bullets could miss, but without the animals, and without men willing to feed, guide, and care for them, there would be nothing left to advance. The German army was not an invincible machine. It was a fragile chain of life, stretched thin across hundreds of miles, dependent on creatures who could neither speak nor refuse, and men who often wished they could. Johann tightened the reins, murmuring a prayer to whatever god might be listening, and nudged Otto forward. Each step, heavy and uncertain, carried not just artillery and food, but the hope that the army could somehow continue, one sweat-soaked, mud-covered, hoof-driven mile at a time. By July, Ernst Vogel spread the maps across the command wagon, tracing the route with trembling fingers. Paris had been only 300 kilometers away. Moscow was over 1,000. The army's supply lines could only reach 300 kilometers from railheads. Yet the front stretched nearly 2,000 kilometers wide. Logistics could not keep pace. Ernst Vogel unfolded the map across the wooden table of the command wagon, his fingers tracing the lines with a tremor he could not hide. Paris had been only 300 kilometers away when Germany's tanks had rolled west in 1940. Now Moscow was over 1,000 kilometers into unknown territory, and the railways could not carry enough food, ammunition, or fuel to sustain the push. He had memorized the distances, the calculations, the limits of supply, but every morning, as the sun rose over the endless wheat fields and dense forests of western Russia, the numbers seemed to mock him. Logistics were not just numbers. They were men, wagons, horses, and exhausted drivers, all stretched past the breaking point. Ernst was not alone in his dread. Around him, officers huddled over their own maps, muttering figures under their breaths, faces pale from sunburn and worry. Lieutenant Friedrich Neumann tapped his pencil impatiently. "It doesn't add up, Ernst," he said. "Even if we move everything by rail, we can only go 300 kilometers before the supply lines collapse. Moscow is over triple that. The men will starve, the tanks will stall, and yet the Führer demands we advance without pause." The truth of it weighed on Ernst more heavily than any fear of battle. The front already stretched nearly 2,000 kilometers wide, a living beast that could not be tamed. Any misstep in one sector caused chaos across the rest. One frozen bridge, one sabotaged rail line, one delayed wagon, and entire units would be stranded, their morale crumbling under the merciless sun and the looming threat of winter. He had seen it happen in the north, where a column of trucks had stalled in mud so deep it swallowed axles and engines alike, and the soldiers had been forced to abandon their vehicles, trudging onward with nothing but rifles and hope. Outside, the roar of distant artillery reminded him that the map was not just numbers and lines. It was reality. Villages burned in the distance, and the cries of wounded men carried on the wind. Ernst remembered the early days of the invasion, the Blitzkrieg, the rapid victories, the celebrations back in Berlin. Then the reality of the Soviet Union had sunk in. Fields stretched endlessly, forests swallowed men whole, and the railways, critical veins of movement, were narrow, fragile, and constantly under attack. Supply depots were hundreds of kilometers apart, and the calculations showed only one cruel truth. The army could not sustain itself this far from its base. He thought of the soldiers he had met along the way. Hans, barely 17, carrying shells heavier than his own body, had asked him one night, shivering and malnourished, "Ernst, why do we keep going if we can't get food? Why do we march if there is nothing behind us?" Ernst had no answer. He could only stare at the maps, at the unbroken lines stretching east, and realize that the mathematics of war were absolute. Distance did not lie. Supply chains did not bend to willpower. Men did not march faster because orders demanded it. Even the horses felt the strain. Ernst had watched the animals collapse, their flanks heaving, their hooves sinking into mud and frozen soil alike. The mechanized dream of Germany relied as much on human endurance and animal strength as on tanks and trucks. Every mile eastward was a gamble with exhaustion, starvation, and the cruelty of the land itself. The generals could draw arrows on maps, But the numbers, distance, weight, and speed remained indifferent to strategy or hope. Night fell and Ernst returned to his bunk, the map still spread across the table. He traced the route with a finger, imagining the supply trains snaking across the fields, loaded with food, fuel, and ammunition, only to stall, broken and abandoned. Moscow was still over 1,000 kilometers away. The men would reach it only if the impossible became reality. And the impossible rarely did. As he lay under a thin blanket, the distant boom of artillery echoing in his ears, Ernst understood the bitter truth. The war had already been doomed the moment the army crossed the border. Not by the Soviet soldiers, not by frost or sabotage, but by math. By the inexorable, unforgiving arithmetic of distance and logistics. No courage, no genius, no planning could rewrite those numbers. From the first day, the map had been a silent executioner. The greatest invasion in history had ignored the simplest lesson. That some wars could not be won on maps alone. Friedrich Lang stared out of the train window as the engine screeched and coughed, smoke trailing behind like a wounded bird. The rails ahead were strange, impossibly wide, a cruel trick of geography and Soviet planning. His heart sank. German trains could not run on these tracks. The supplies loaded hours ago, food, ammunition, winter clothing, would not reach the men at the front. He gripped the edge of the window until his knuckles turned white, the weight of inevitability pressing down harder than any artillery shell ever could. 3 days into the invasion, the first supply train ground to a halt forever. Locomotives, stubborn and overloaded, had refused to move, their wheels spinning helplessly on rails that were just a few inches too wide. Engineers cursed, mechanics hammered metal desperately, but physics was immutable. Every wagon that derailed, every crate that tipped into the mud, was another promise broken. The soldiers marching east would go hungry. The guns at the front would fall silent. And slowly, inexorably, men would die, not from bullets or bombs, but from the unforgiving arithmetic of distance and infrastructure. Friedrich remembered the first village they passed, the signs in Cyrillic he could not read, the small children staring at the column of armored trucks with a mixture of fear and curiosity. He wondered if they understood the fragility of the army that claimed to be unstoppable. He wondered if they knew that a single railway gauge could stop an empire in its tracks. The German high command had assumed the Soviet rails would bend to their will, that locomotives could somehow be adapted, that supplies would flow as freely as they had in France. None of it had happened. The men around him were tense, muttering curses under their breath. Sergeant Klein kicked at a crate of spoiled rations, sending a cloud of dust into the summer air. 3 days, and it's already a disaster. He spat, eyes blazing with frustration. We can't eat, we can't move the guns, and the men at the front will starve before we even reach them. Friedrich nodded silently. Words were useless here. Only action mattered, and there was no action that could undo the stubborn gap between German logistics and Soviet reality. Every kilometer had to be rebuilt. Bridges destroyed or sabotaged had to be repaired with hands raw from labor, with axes and hammers that splintered against frozen timbers. Tracks had to be laid one rail at a time, bolts driven by men whose fingers were blistered, calloused, and bleeding. Horses strained against wagons as soldiers carried spare ties, nails, and planks, the animals breathing heavily in the heat of the day. Every hour lost was a day closer to starvation. Every delay was a whisper of death, a reminder that this was not a Blitzkrieg, but a war against mathematics, terrain, and endurance. Friedrich climbed down from the train to inspect the damage, feeling the sun burn his neck. He could see the horizon shivering in heat waves, the soldiers dragging supplies toward the stalled engine, their boots sinking into mud and sand alike. A young recruit collapsed beside a wagon, sobbing in frustration and fatigue. I can't keep going, he whispered. Friedrich knelt beside him, offering water, a rough hand on the boy's shoulder. We don't have a choice, he said softly. Every step counts. Every meter we rebuild, someone lives another day. That's all we can do. The train remained motionless, a silent sentinel of failure, mocking the idea of an invincible army. Engines cooled, wheels rusted slightly in the hot sun, and the horizon stretched endlessly eastward, merciless and indifferent. Friedrich understood, with a clarity that made his chest ache, that the Soviet railways were more than wood and steel. They were a weapon of geography, patience, and inevitability. They had stopped an empire not with bombs, not with bullets, but with inches. Inches too wide, rails too far apart, supply lines too fragile. As night fell, he sat beside the still train, watching embers from a small fire flicker into the sky. The men around him slept uneasily, dreams haunted by hunger and exhaustion. Friedrich pulled his jacket tighter around him, listening to the horses breathing in the dark, and thought of the soldiers ahead, marching with empty stomachs, their rifles heavy in their hands. Death was patient, methodical, and waiting for them along the tracks they could not traverse. The rails had spoken, the empire had stopped, and nothing could change the verdict. By October, Karl Huber trudged through the charred remains of villages. Bridges, fuel depots, warehouses, all destroyed by retreating Soviets. Germany advanced into nothing. By October, they had converted 1,000 kilometers of rail. They needed 6,000. Karl Huber trudged through the remnants of a village that had been burned to the ground, his boots crunching on ash and splintered wood. The Soviets had retreated with methodical ruthlessness, leaving Germany to advance into nothing. Bridges lay in shattered ruins across swollen rivers, twisted metal mocking the engineers who tried to repair them. Tracks were ripped up or bent beyond recognition, a tangle of steel that no locomotive could traverse without hours of backbreaking labor. Stations and warehouses, once bustling with life and goods, were reduced to skeletons of brick and timber. The invaders were stepping into a land that had already died, and the consequences were immediate and brutal. Karl was part of a unit tasked with reconstructing the railway, 1 mile at a time, 1 rail at a time, under the indifferent October sky. By now, the mornings were cold, the nights colder, and every effort seemed almost futile. Soldiers and horses worked side by side, hauling rails, pounding spikes into frozen sleepers, dragging ballast from nearby quarries. Every kilometer rebuilt was a victory, but it was a small one against the immensity of what remained undone. By October, they had converted 1,000 kilometers of rail, yet the goal was 6,000. 6,000 kilometers to sustain the army, to feed the men at the front, to keep the tanks moving, to deliver ammunition. 6,000 kilometers might never be enough. The men were exhausted, faces pale from hard labor and lack of nutrition, eyes hollow with the recognition that they were fighting not just an enemy army, but a land that refused to yield. Hunger gnawed at their stomachs, blisters covered their hands, and frost already hinted at its coming presence in the early mornings. The Soviet scorched earth tactics had left nothing to scavenge, nothing to ease the strain. Karl passed a wagon piled with frozen bread rations, the crust stiff as wood. A young recruit tugged at Karl's sleeve. "Is this all we have to eat today?" he asked, voice trembling. Karl shook his head. "Yes," he said, his throat tight. "We keep moving. We rebuilt. That's all we can do." Even the horses struggled to survive. Their breath steamed in the air, eyes wide and wary as they hauled supplies over ruined tracks and across muddy gaps where bridges had once stood. Karl had seen 2 of them collapse in a single day, unable to carry the weight any longer, their legs giving way under the strain. Men had tried to lift what they could, dragging supplies forward with raw muscle and aching joints. Each lost animal was another crisis. Each lost wagon meant days of delay and the risk of starvation for soldiers waiting further east. Karl paused on the edge of a burned-out rail yard and looked toward the horizon. Smoke from destroyed villages blurred into the gray sky. The silence between explosions and artillery was thick and heavy, as if the land itself were holding its breath. The army that had imagined a swift march to Moscow was being taught a cruel lesson. That territory alone does not sustain an invasion, that every mile conquered had to be paid for with sweat, blood, and patience. The land was already dead, yet it demanded more life to be poured into it. Even the commanders understood the stakes. Maps were spread across tables, charts filled with distances, capacities, and calculations. Yet no chart could replace what the soldiers and horses had to endure on the ground. Every rebuilt kilometer of track was a temporary lifeline, a thread of hope stretched across a wasteland, and yet the ultimate goal loomed like a distant, unreachable shadow. Karl shivered, feeling the cold seep into his bones, and he realized that the army's advance was not a story of conquest but of endurance. Every delay meant hunger, every hunger meant death, and the land, already stripped bare and burned clean, would not relent. Karl took a deep breath, tightened the straps on the cart, and turned back to the work crew. They had miles to go, rails to lay, bridges to rebuild. The wind whipped ash and dirt into their faces, but they moved forward, each man, each horse, a defiant promise against the emptiness. The empire marched into a country that had already died, yet the soldiers and animals labored as if their lives depended on it. In many ways, they did. Survival here was not measured by victories over men, but by victories over terrain, over destruction, and over time itself. By November, Heinrich Müller watched horses collapse in the snow. Each needed 20 kilograms of food daily, 15 million kilograms in total. Supplies did not exist at the front. The animals starved, then froze, then died. Without horses, the army stopped moving. Artillery froze in place. Ammunition wagons remained stranded. Soldiers dragged supplies themselves, muscles raw and shaking, while frostbite stole fingers, toes, and lives. The supposedly mechanized Wehrmacht had been reduced to men and animals, clinging desperately to motion itself as survival. Heinrich Müller trudged along the icy embankment, snow crunching under his boots, every breath visible in the bitter morning air. Around him, the horses stumbled, their flanks ribbed with hunger, eyes dull with exhaustion. Each animal needed 20 kilograms of fodder a day, hay, oats, anything, but the supply trains had long since run dry. The men tried to stretch what little they had, splitting handfuls of straw and stale grain, but it was never enough. 15 million kilograms of food were required every day just to keep the horses alive, and the railways, already crippled by destruction and distance, could not even feed the soldiers. The collapse began slowly. A stallion here, a mare there, legs trembling as frostbite crept up from hoofs to joints. Heinrich had watched a young bay horse collapse mid-step, a wagon full of ammunition sliding into the snow with a thunderous crash. Its rider, barely able to lift the weight alone, cursed violently, kicking the snow with raw desperation. Around them, men were muttering the same grim truth. Without horses, the army could not move. Artillery froze in place, supply wagons blocked roads, ambulances could not carry the wounded. The lifeblood of the Wehrmacht, the very thing that allowed the mechanized illusion to continue, was dying before their eyes. Heinrich shivered, wrapping a threadbare scarf tighter around his neck, and thought of the young recruits marching alongside the horses, their faces red from windburn and exhaustion. They had no choice but to keep moving, dragging wagons themselves when the animals collapsed. Yet every step forward was agony. Frostbite stole fingers and toes faster than bullets could kill. Rations were half of what they needed, and morale sank lower with each lost animal. Soldiers whispered about the iron tyranny of winter, but Heinrich knew it was not cold alone. They were defeated by arithmetic, by logistics, by the sheer impossibility of sustaining an army across a continent. The sound of hooves slowing, then faltering, was like a drumbeat of doom. Heinrich looked back and saw wagons sliding sideways into ditches, ammunition spilling into the snow, bread and salted meat trampled underfoot. The men cursed, fought to salvage what they could, but it was a losing battle. Horses that had carried tons of equipment, that had been the backbone of columns stretching for kilometers, were dying quietly, patiently, and their loss was absolute. Where once there had been motion, there was only frozen stillness. By midday, the full weight of the crisis was evident. Columns halted, engines idled uselessly, wheels spun in vain on muddy tracks. Heinrich's own unit could not advance. Every push forward was met with the immovable weight of animals that could not rise, wagons that could not roll, and soldiers too exhausted to carry the day's burden. The army, which had imagined itself a machine of steel and precision, ground to a halt. Without horses, nothing moved. Not artillery, not supplies, not hope. Heinrich knelt beside a collapsed mare, pressing his gloved hand to her cold flank, feeling the life drain slowly. Around him, others did the same, whispering apologies they knew the animals could not understand. Each death was a small fracture in the illusion of invincibility. Each fallen horse was another mile the army could not cover, another day that supplies would not reach the front, another step closer to disaster. That night, Heinrich sat on a splintered crate beside a fire that barely warmed the freezing wind. The sounds of the fallen, horses, wagons, and men alike, echoed in his ears. He thought of home, of green fields and warm kitchens, of meals that did not taste of desperation and snow. And he understood, with a clarity that gnawed at his soul, that the army's strength had always rested on fragile legs and patient animals. When the horses starved, froze, and collapsed, the invincible Wehrmacht had stopped moving. Not because of strategy, not because of courage, not because of bullets, but because life itself, carried on hooves and hearts, could not be sustained. The winter was coming, merciless and absolute, and with it, the realization that the greatest army Europe had ever known was powerless, not in battle but in endurance. Heinrich wrapped his hands around his knees and stared into the darkness, listening to the last faint breathing of horses nearby, and understood the truth of the war. Motion itself was life, and when the lifelines died, so did the empire's advance. By December, Lucas Steiner and his comrades pulled sleds across icy plains. 8 hours to move a single mile. Frozen food that could not be eaten filled the sleds. Heavy guns were abandoned. Wounded soldiers were left behind. Men had become machines, dragging themselves and supplies through snowdrifts. Motion was life. The army's pride, the tanks, the artillery, the precision of previous victories was irrelevant. Only the raw endurance of men, frostbitten and starving, kept the advance inching forward. Lucas Steiner gritted his teeth as he leaned into the frozen sled, the ropes cutting into his raw hands. 8 hours to move a single mile. 8 hours for a distance that, in Germany, would have taken minutes. The snow lay thick, brittle underfoot, yet the sled sank into drifts anyway, heavy with supplies that were no longer much use. Blocks of frozen meat and bread that could not be eaten jammed against the wooden planks, brittle and unchewable. He spat into the snow, tasting the bitterness of frost and despair. The horses were gone, starved, frozen, and collapsed, leaving the army to become its own engine. Men replaced animals, muscles straining under weights designed for beasts, each step forward a battle against the snow, the cold, and gravity itself. Sleds groaned and cracked as they slid over uneven terrain, and the men shouted to coordinate, voices swallowed by the howling wind. 8 hours to move 1 mile. 8 hours to inch closer to nowhere. Around him, others cursed and collapsed into the snow, exhausted beyond reason. One soldier tried to lift a crate of ammunition, only to drop it with a loud crash, the shells scattering across the ice. Heavy guns were abandoned in the chaos, left behind in deep drifts where no man could pull them. The cannons, which had once thundered like storms over Europe, now stood frozen monuments to failure. Their barrels iced over, wheels buried, their purpose lost. Lucas passed a young private, shivering uncontrollably, his face blue, his lips cracking. The boy had been carrying a small supply of medical rations, already frozen solid. "We can't eat this," he murmured, eyes hollow. Lucas nodded, understanding the futility of survival when the simplest needs could not be met. The wounded were left behind, lying half-buried in the snow, moaning quietly. Each step forward meant another soldier abandoned, another life reduced to a statistic the generals could not count, another fragment of humanity crushed beneath the weight of war and frost. The landscape stretched endlessly, a white wasteland under a gray sky. Villages had been burned, railways torn apart, bridges destroyed. Everything the army might have used to sustain itself was gone. Each mile was an achievement, yes, but only a reminder of how far they still were from Moscow, how thin the threads of survival had become. Men were pulling themselves and each other forward, relying on sheer will, desperation, and the faint hope that the front could somehow be reached. Lucas thought of home, of green hills and warmth and hearths, but those images were quickly replaced by the stark reality surrounding him. The snow, the cold, the endless white fields, and the weight of frozen supplies that could not nourish them. 8 hours to move a single mile, and even that mile might not bring salvation. Each movement was laborious, every breath a battle, and yet the army continued, because to stop was to die. Even the officers struggled. Commanders shouted orders, though they themselves pulled at ropes, hammers, and sleds when they could, realizing the absurdity of strategy against sheer physical exhaustion. The men had become machines of muscle, grinding forward mile by mile, hour by hour, pulling what the horses once carried, abandoning what they could not, and leaving behind those too weak to endure. By nightfall, the column had moved barely a mile. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes, rations were unusable, and morale was collapsing under the weight of snow and hopelessness. Lucas lay against the sled, trying to warm his hands on his chest, listening to the distant cries of the wounded left behind. The army, once a symbol of speed, efficiency, and power, had been reduced to men dragging themselves in frozen sleds across a wasteland. Motion itself was survival, and every hour of labor was a reminder that nature, distance, and mathematics had defeated them long before any Soviet rifle had. Lucas closed his eyes, exhausted, shivering, and whispered a prayer he did not believe in. Tomorrow they will pull again. 8 hours for 1 mile. 1 step closer to Moscow. 1 step closer to despair. And 1 step further from hope. The wind cut through the streets of Moscow like a blade, carrying with it a bitter taste of iron and smoke. Outside the city, the German soldiers were frozen in place, their rifles slipping from numb fingers, their breath crystallizing in the frigid air. They were not hiding. They were not advancing. They were barely alive. Karl Fischer, a young corporal from Hamburg, pressed his back against a frost-covered tree, shivering violently, and wondered how it had come to this. His boots, wrapped in soggy newspapers, offered little protection against the ground that had turned to solid ice. He looked around and saw comrades whose faces were pale, lips cracked, and eyes glazed over, staring into nothingness. A thin scream carried across the snow. Someone had lost a finger to frostbite. Another man had already lost a foot. Karl swallowed back bile, his stomach twisting with fear and helplessness. Months ago, he had marched into the Soviet Union with confidence. Operation Barbarossa had promised glory. 3 million men had crossed the border, tanks rumbling like thunder, planes slicing the sky with razor precision. Hitler had assured them of victory, another France, another swift collapse. Karl had believed in it once. He had believed in the discipline, in the strategy, in the invincibility of the Wehrmacht. But the land had other plans. Distances stretched like cruel illusions, villages giving way to forests, forests giving way to frozen rivers that cracked under the weight of tanks and trucks. Railways, their gauges different from what the engineers expected, slowed supply lines to a crawl. By the time food and ammunition arrived, it was often too late, frozen into useless slabs of metal and paper. The first frost came in September. It was mild at first, a harbinger, almost welcome compared to the burning sun and dust of June. But October brought ice that cut through leather and flesh alike, and by November the cold had become a living enemy, stalking them, invisible and unrelenting. Soldiers burned their rifles, hoping the heat would keep their fingers from falling off. They piled fuel around themselves and set it ablaze, only to watch the flames lick at their legs and arms, warning of the fragility of warmth. Night brought terror. Snow piled high, swallowing the footprints of retreat. Wolves, gaunt and desperate, circled the camps, drawn to the smell of frostbitten flesh. Karl thought of his mother back in Hamburg, of her hands folded over one another in prayer each morning. She had sent him a scarf, thick and woolen, but even that could not protect him. He had watched his friend, Dieter, lift his frostbitten hand and try to write a letter to his family, only to drop the pencil as the skin split and cracked. Dieter's eyes met Karl's, wide with disbelief and pain, and Karl realized that no training, no battle-hardened courage, no oath sworn to Hitler could save them from the cold that now ruled the land. The soldiers had begun to whisper, a dangerous thing when morale could shatter like ice underfoot. Some said the army was cursed. Others muttered that the Russians themselves had woven the frost into a weapon, a silent, perfect instrument of annihilation. The officers barked orders, but even they struggled against numb fingers and frozen boots. Vehicles refused to start. Engines seized. Tanks bogged down in snowdrifts taller than men. Supplies rotted in their crates, untouched, as if the land itself had decided that the invaders would not pass. Karl had seen generals curse maps and sky alike, pacing in despair as if sheer will could turn frost into fuel. It was January before the first retreat orders came. But by then, Karl and the remaining soldiers had already seen comrades die quietly in the snow, faces hidden in white, bodies stiff as statues. The proudest army Europe had ever known. The same army that had marched into France and Belgium with unstoppable precision, now stumbled back across the icy steppes. Not defeated by bullets, not crushed beneath artillery, but undone by the simplest mathematics of distance, logistics, and temperature. Every step they had taken into the Soviet Union had brought them farther from warmth, farther from food, farther from life. Karl adjusted the tattered scarf around his neck, watching his own breath crystallize into the sky. Somewhere to the north, the first fires of Russian winter burned bright in small villages, indifferent to the invaders. Karl wondered how it would feel to return home, to see green fields instead of endless white, to feel warmth on his skin without the sting of frostbite. For now, he would survive the day, and tomorrow the next, clinging to the hope that distance and cold had mercy, even if men did not. In the end, it was not a heroic battle, not the sound of guns or the precision of strategy, that had decided this chapter of history. It was the patient, unyielding force of winter, the vastness of the land, and the unforgiving mathematics of supply and distance. Karl shivered, staring at the horizon where Moscow's silhouette lay dark against the snow, and understood the truth he would carry for the rest of his life. The greatest army in Europe had not fallen to human enemies. It had destroyed itself, slowly, silently, one frostbitten step at a time. And then the Soviets struck, not with the force of artillery alone, but with speed and cunning that exploited the Wehrmacht's paralysis. Ski troops moved past frozen tanks, their white silhouettes sliding silently across the snow. Infantry bypassed immobile divisions, seizing what had been Germany's pride. Pristine machines left untouched, yet useless. Entire units were overrun, encircled, and captured. Guns that could have fired thousands of rounds, tanks that could have crushed resistance, now fell intact into enemy hands, gleaming trophies of arithmetic rather than heroism. The invasion had already failed. It was not the skill of the Red Army that ended the campaign. It was the simple, unforgiving truth of numbers. Supply lines stretched too far, distances too great, winter too cruel. The soldiers who had marched into Russia with confidence, who had imagined speed and victory, now faced an enemy they could not fight with courage alone. They faced frostbite, starvation, frozen engines, and the relentless certainty of arithmetic. The army that had never lost a battle, that had marched across Europe with terrifying precision, had lost the war without ever being decisively defeated in combat. They needed 6,000 kilometers of rail. They built 1,000. Fuel meant to carry them 600 kilometers could only move them 300. Winter coats, boots, gloves, and blankets for 3 million men did not exist at the front. The first supply train had stopped, and with it, the fate of the invasion had been sealed. In war, bullets kill soldiers, but logistics, cold, math, distance, and exhaustion kills armies. The Wehrmacht had marched into history as the most powerful army in Europe, but it was not the Red Army, the Frost, or even Hitler's hubris that won. It was the arithmetic they refused to heed. Snow froze the engines. Starvation killed horses. Distances consumed supply lines. By the time the winter encirclements began, the greatest army Europe had ever seen had become a monument to what happens when logistics fail. Friedrich Kohler stared at the frozen tanks lined like tombstones across the snow-covered plains. Oil had congealed in engines, pistons seized, and metal cracked under the unforgiving frost. Out of 10,000 tanks that had once thundered across Europe, fewer than 100 could move. They were not destroyed by enemy fire, not pierced by shells or sabotaged from within. They were simply frozen, empty of fuel, of life, of purpose. Machinery that had promised invincibility now sat silently, gleaming dully beneath the gray sky, waiting for something that would never come. Soldiers shuffled past them, shivering, hollow-eyed, dragging sleds and wagons in a desperate mimicry of the power the machines had once given them. The collapse was complete. Guns could not fire. Artillery lay idle. Locomotives refused to run. Every inch of the Wehrmacht's famed mechanization had been rendered useless, not by the Red Army's bullets, but by frost, hunger, and impossibility. Men cursed the winter, the snow, the land, and even their own commanders. They realized, bitterly, that the power they had counted on, machines, engines, steel, depended entirely on fragile logistics. Without fuel, without food, without horses, without a single functioning engine, the great war machine of Germany had ground to a dead stop. They needed 6,000 kilometers of rail, they built 1,000. Fuel for 600 kilometers, they had enough for 300. Winter coats for 3 million men, they had none. The invasion was lost the moment the first supply train stopped. In war, bullets kill soldiers, but logistics kills armies. Victory is calculated, not fought, and in 1941, Germany had miscalculated.